When they told him to leave the building, they didn't shout, they didn't insult him openly, and they didn't even seem uncomfortable doing it, because power rarely feels the need to explain itself, and humiliation often arrives wrapped in professionalism. The words were polite, rehearsed, and legally clean. Your role has been made redundant. But the meaning behind them was brutal, because 15 years of loyalty, sacrifice, and silent contribution were being erased in a single sentence spoken. Across a polished conference table, inside a glass room he had once helped design, surrounded by people who had built their careers on his ideas and now couldn't meet his eyes. He stood there calmly, hands resting at his sides, listening as if this meeting were happening to someone else, because shock doesn't always scream, sometimes it numbs, and in that numbness, clarity begins to form. He noticed small things, the way the CEO avoided using his name, the way the HR director read from notes instead of speaking naturally, the way the junior executive across the table looked almost guilty, and he understood immediately that this decision hadn't been sudden. It had been prepared, discussed, justified, and approved long before he was invited into the room, and that realization hurt far more than the decision itself. 15 years earlier, he had walked into this company with nothing but skill, discipline, and hunger. No family connections, no powerful sponsors, no shortcuts, just work and lots of it. He stayed late when others left early, solved problems no one wanted to touch, and quietly became the person everyone relied on but no one officially credited, because organizations love effort until effort threatens ego, and somewhere along the way, his competence had become uncomfortable for people who valued titles more than truth. Now those same people sat comfortably while he was being escorted out of the story they believed they owned. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" Someone finally asked, not because they wanted to hear it, but because the script required the question. He thought about it for a moment, not because he lacked words, but because he had too many, and then he shook his head gently. "No," he said, and stood up. That single word confused them more than anger ever could have, because anger would have validated their power, and silence denied it. Security followed him at a respectful distance as he walked through the open office floor, past desks where conversations stopped mid-sentence, past faces that looked away too quickly, past others that watched with curiosity rather than sympathy. He didn't rush, didn't drag his feet, didn't perform sadness or pride, because dignity is not a reaction, it's a decision, and he had made his. When the glass doors closed behind him, the sound echoed longer than it should have, sharp and final, and in that moment the company believed they had ended something because they mistook removal for erasure, and they would spend years learning how wrong that assumption was. The first night after being fired is always the hardest, not because of fear, but because the noise stops. There are no meetings, no emails, no calls, no deadlines, just time, and time forces honesty. He sat alone in his apartment, city lights spilling through the window, replaying the last few years in his head. Not emotionally, but strategically. Recognizing moments when decisions were made without him, when credit shifted subtly, when his influence began to threaten people who had learned how to survive without contributing, and slowly, painfully, a truth emerged. He wasn't removed because he failed, he was removed because he could not be controlled anymore. That realization changed everything. Instead of asking, "Why me?" he began asking, "How does this system really work?" And that question would become the foundation of his transformation. He didn't rush to update his resume or announce his availability online, because desperation makes you visible to the wrong people, and he needed invisibility. He spent days reading, studying, reconnecting quietly with people outside his former company. Consultants, investors, analysts, listening more than speaking, absorbing how ownership, influence, and control actually moved behind the scenes, because he had spent his career mastering execution, but now he wanted to understand power. Weeks turned into months, and during that time something unexpected happened. He stopped feeling bitter. Bitterness requires emotional attachment, and he was letting go of that attachment piece by piece, replacing it with perspective, and perspective is dangerous, because it allows you to see patterns others are too involved to notice. He began consulting, selectively, not for money alone, but for access. Every project taught him something new about markets, leverage, and fragility, and he noticed a pattern repeating across industries. Companies don't collapse because of competition, they collapse because of internal arrogance. Leadership grows comfortable, decision-making slows, reality gets filtered, and by the time problems become visible, the damage is already embedded. And quietly, In the background of all this learning, he kept watching his former company. At first, everything looked fine. Press releases, promotions, confident interviews, but beneath the surface, cracks were forming. A risky expansion he had once advised against was draining resources, talent turnover was increasing, and short-term wins were being prioritized over long-term stability, and he recognized the signs immediately because he had once been the person preventing these exact mistakes. He didn't celebrate their struggles. He documented them. Patience became his greatest advantage because while others chased immediate validation, he was building distance, and distance creates leverage. He invested carefully, diversified intelligently, and avoided anything that would tie his identity too publicly to his next move, because he understood something most people don't. Revenge that announces itself too early loses its power. 1 year after being fired, the first major investor quietly exited the company. The news barely made headlines, but he noticed. 6 months later, another followed. Still, he said nothing. Because when pressure enters a system, it doesn't explode immediately. It compresses, and compression creates opportunity. He formed a small holding entity, then another, each legally separate, each intentionally boring, each designed to look unremarkable, because the most effective moves are the ones no one bothers to question, and slowly, methodically, he began positioning himself around the edges of the company that had once escorted him out, not as an enemy, not as a savior, but as an inevitability. 2 years after the day the glass doors closed behind him, the company announced a restructuring. Layoffs followed. Morale dropped. Leadership blamed market conditions. And for the first time, he allowed himself a small, private acknowledgement. Not satisfaction, not joy, but readiness. Because this was the moment he had been waiting for. Not the fall, but the opening. He understood something most people never do. Collapse is rarely loud, and power almost never announces its arrival. After the restructuring was announced, the company worked hard to project confidence. Town halls were scheduled, optimistic emails were sent, leadership spoke about alignment and future vision. But behind closed doors, fear had entered the system, and fear changes behavior because people stop thinking long-term when they are trying to survive the present. He stayed invisible. Not inactive, just unseen. While executives argued over budgets and optics, he studied financial filings, debt structures, vendor dependencies, and shareholder movements with the calm focus of someone assembling a puzzle he had already seen once before. This wasn't emotional for him anymore, it was mechanical, because once you remove ego from a situation, patterns become obvious, and the pattern here was clear. The company was overextended, underled, and internally fractured. Consulting had given him something invaluable: range. He now understood multiple industries, how capital flowed between them, how reputations rose and fell quietly, and how influence could be exercised without fingerprints. He had also rebuilt trust with people who mattered, not the loud ones, but the steady ones, the investors who valued discipline, the advisors who respected patience, the partners who knew that long games always beat short ones. He never mentioned his former company. He didn't need to. They were doing his work for him. As profits dipped and forecasts were revised, leadership began making reactive decisions, cutting costs in places that protected stability, promoting loyalty over competence, choosing speed over accuracy, and each decision created another small crack, and cracks don't seem dangerous until they connect. That was when he made his first real move. Not toward the company directly, but toward its ecosystem. He acquired a minor stake in a supplier through a holding group, nothing dramatic, nothing controlling, just enough to see the inside of the machinery, and what he saw confirmed everything: delayed payments, renegotiated contracts, pressure disguised as partnership. From there, he moved outward, not inward, placing himself in positions where information flowed naturally, where insight arrived without being requested. Information is the purest form of leverage. Months passed. The company announced a strategic pivot. The market reacted politely. Internally, uncertainty grew. Executives started protecting their own departments instead of the organization as a whole, because fear turns teams into islands, and islands sink faster than continents. He watched all of this with the calm distance of someone no longer emotionally invested, because attachment clouds judgment, and judgment was now his strongest asset. He formed another entity, then another, each structured differently, each connected loosely but legally separate, and through these structures he began acquiring debt. Quietly, legally, patiently, because ownership doesn't always come through shares, sometimes it comes through obligation, and obligation has a way of reshaping authority. Still, he stayed quiet. No interviews. No public appearances. No hints. Because timing isn't about speed, it's about readiness. Inside the company, rumors started circulating. Someone powerful was circling. No one knew who. Board meetings grew tense, legal advisors were consulted more frequently, and leadership began speaking in hypotheticals because when certainty disappears, language becomes defensive. He noticed this shift immediately because he had once been the person translating reality into action, and now there was no one left who could do that without fear. One afternoon, he received a call from an old contact. Not a friend. Not an enemy. A realist. The message was simple. If you're planning something, the window is opening. He thanked them and hung up. That night, he reviewed everything one last time. Not because he doubted the plan, but because discipline demands verification. The numbers aligned, the legal structures were sound, the exposure was controlled, and most importantly, the company was tired, and tired organizations make mistakes because exhaustion lowers defenses faster than arrogance ever could. He moved. Through intermediaries, negotiations began. Complex, technical, intentionally dull. Lawyers spoke to lawyers, advisors spoke to advisors, and slowly ownership consolidated, not in one dramatic shift, but in a series of movements too boring to attract attention. And that was exactly the point, because drama invites resistance and boredom invites neglect. By the time anyone inside the company realized what was happening, it was already happening too fast to stop. Control wasn't gone yet, but it was slipping. The board called emergency meetings. PowerPoint decks multiplied. Everyone searched for a solution that didn't require admitting failure. He remained silent, because silence at the right moment becomes gravity. As pressure increased, mistakes accelerated, conflicting public statements, internal leaks, rushed decisions, and each error reduced confidence further, creating a feedback loop that leadership couldn't escape, because they were reacting instead of leading, and reaction is always slower than preparation. That was when he made the move that mattered most. He didn't buy the company. He positioned himself so the company would need him. Through debt conversion options, voting rights, and restructuring clauses, influence shifted. Not aggressively, not visibly, but decisively. Lawyers signed, advisors nodded, documents finalized, and with each signature, the balance tipped further away from the people who believed titles protected them. The board scheduled a meeting. Routine on paper. Urgent in reality. No one knew exactly what would happen, only that something unavoidable had arrived, and as the date approached, tension filled the building like static before a storm, because uncertainty is more frightening than bad news, and they were drowning in it. He prepared nothing special. No speech. No dramatic entrance. Because the moment didn't require performance. It required presence. On the morning of the meeting, he dressed simply, not to appear humble, but because he had nothing to prove. Confidence that seeks validation is insecurity in disguise, and he had outgrown that phase long ago. As he walked toward the building he had once been escorted out of, he felt no anger, no triumph, just alignment, because everything had arrived exactly where it was supposed to. The doors opened, not metaphorically, literally, and he walked in, not as an employee, not as a guest, but as something far more dangerous to ego than either, an owner without the need for permission. Faces changed as recognition spread. Some instantly, some slowly, some too late. The meeting hadn't even started yet, but power had already shifted, because authority isn't declared in meetings. It's felt in silence, and the silence in that room was heavy, thick, undeniable. He took his seat, calm, unrushed, unreactive, and for the first time since the day they asked him to leave, he saw something familiar in their eyes. Not confidence, not control, but awareness. They were no longer ahead of him. They were behind, and they finally knew it. The room didn't erupt when he entered. There were no gasps, no raised voices, no dramatic reactions. Just a silence so thick it felt deliberate, as if the air itself had decided to pause and observe. People who had once spoken freely now measured every breath, every movement, because uncertainty had finally found a face, and that face was familiar in the most uncomfortable way possible. He took his seat without ceremony. No one welcomed him. No one challenged him. The meeting began the way all meetings do. Formalities, agenda items, legal acknowledgments. But the words floated uselessly above the table, because everyone knew the real reason they were there had already arrived. Documents were distributed, names were read, percentages explained, and with each clarification, the reality sharpened. Control had shifted, not explosively, not dramatically, but completely. The CEO tried to maintain composure, nodding along, asking procedural questions, pretending this was just another complication to be managed. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him, because deep down, he understood something irreversible had happened. Authority had changed hands without his permission. And authority hates surprises. When the legal advisor finished, the room waited. Not for instructions. For him. He didn't rush to speak because silence was doing the work for him. People shifted in their chairs, eyes flickered toward him and then away, memories resurfaced uninvited. The day he was escorted out, the meetings where his warnings were ignored, the jokes made after he left, the confidence with which they believed the story had ended. He stood slowly, not to dominate the room, to acknowledge it. "I won't take much time," he said, his voice calm, measured, devoid of emotion, and that absence of emotion unsettled them more than anger ever could, because anger can be dismissed, but calm demands attention. "I'm not here to revisit the past," he continued. "What happened happened. You made decisions you believed were right. So did I." That sentence alone reframed everything, because it denied them the comfort of defensiveness. He wasn't accusing, wasn't blaming, wasn't seeking validation. He was stating reality, and reality has a way of cornering people without raising its voice. "The company is at a crossroads," he said. "Not because of the market, not because of competition, but because of how it's been led." A few people shifted uncomfortably. He let that sit. "For years," he went on, "execution carried this organization forward. Hard work, operational discipline, quiet problem-solving. But over time, decisions became political instead of practical. Optics replaced outcomes. Titles replaced accountability. No names. No finger-pointing. Just truth. And when that happens," he said, "systems don't fail all at once. They weaken slowly. They rely on momentum. They consume goodwill. And eventually, they run out of both." The CEO opened his mouth to respond, but thought better of it. For the first time in years, someone else was setting the tone. "I didn't come back to punish anyone," he said. "I didn't come back to relive grievances. I came back because this company still has value, and because value is worth protecting, even when leadership forgets how." That sentence landed differently, not as revenge, as responsibility. He outlined the next steps clearly, restructuring, leadership changes, operational resets. Not as threats but as inevitabilities, because once ownership shifts, resistance becomes irrelevant. Some executives would remain, some would transition out, some roles would change, and for the first time in a long time, the criteria would be competence, not comfort. There were no protests, no arguments. Because when power is real, it doesn't argue, it decides. The meeting ended without applause. People left quietly, gathering their things, avoiding eye contact, processing the speed with which their certainty had dissolved. The building felt different already, not physically but psychologically, like a place that had just exhaled after holding its breath for too long. He stayed behind for a moment, alone in the room. He looked around, not with nostalgia, not with resentment, but with recognition. This place had shaped him, tested him, dismissed him, and unintentionally prepared him, and he felt no urge to reclaim the past, because the past no longer held power over him. In the weeks that followed, change moved quickly, not recklessly, decisively. Redundant structures were removed, real accountability was restored, and for the first time in years, people were rewarded for results rather than proximity to authority. Morale didn't spike overnight, but trust began to return, and trust is the most difficult thing to rebuild once it's been broken. Some of the people who had once looked away when he was escorted out now worked under his leadership. He treated them professionally, fairly, without bitterness, because the point had never been to humiliate, it had been to correct. The CEO resigned quietly. No press drama, no public conflict, just an exit that mirrored the way power truly changes hands, without noise. Months later, as the company stabilized, someone asked him a question he had been expecting but never needed to answer. "How did you know this would work?" He paused, not because he didn't know, but because the truth was simple and rarely accepted. "I didn't," he said. I just understood how systems behave when ego replaces responsibility. That was the lesson. Not revenge. Not domination. Understanding. Because the real transformation hadn't happened in the boardroom. It had happened the night he was fired, sitting alone in silence, choosing clarity over bitterness, patience over reaction, strategy over noise. He never framed the story as victory. He framed it as consequence. Because when people mistake your silence for weakness, they reveal how little they understand about strength. And when they push you out without respect, they may be giving you the very distance you need to see the whole structure clearly. Years later, when new employees joined the company, they heard fragments of the story. Not as legend, not as warning, but as culture. A reminder that titles don't build organizations, people do, and that the most dangerous person in a room is not the loudest, but the one who understands how everything works and waits. The man they kicked out never announced his return. He didn't need to, because success doesn't knock. It replaces the lock.